Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this week's first edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyam Vogo and thank you for tuning in. On the show tonight, we look at the governing ANC's thoughts on what will turn our struggling economy around. This in a week we're going to hear more bad news from many South Africans. The fuel price is expected to go up again on Wednesday. New unemployment figures are coming out tomorrow. The last quarterly labor force survey for the second quarter of 2021 painted the worst picture of unemployment since the survey's introduction in 2008. The bad news arriving, of course, after the governing party, the ANC, released at the weekend all manner of discussion documents on how they see our economic direction. We put all these events into context and perspective as we look ahead at the week in South Africa. Well, let me introduce you to the first two of my guests for this evening. Dr. Asghar Adelzadeh has just released a discussion document entitled, "Why is the South African Economy Stuck in Chronic Crises?" Peliswa Ngomo is a development economist, of course, also a regular on the program, very familiar with the inner workings of that ANC Economic Transformation Committee. Later on, we will also be joined by Michael Bagrain, who is a labor analyst, to talk, of course, about the unemployment figures expected to come out tomorrow. Let's begin with this inset. Of course, one of our colleagues went along to the ANC's briefing yesterday, and that's where the head of the Economic Transformation Committee of the ANC was explaining just some of, talking journalists through some of the decisions that they have come up with. Of course, those decisions would still need to be rubber stamped by the policy conference. They will then have to be adopted at the party's elective conference in December. But at least it begins, or those documents begin to give you a sense of what could be foremost in the minds of the ANC faithful right now. Here's that inset to get us going.
The ANC reminded the media of the new and difficult landscape that policymakers now have to operate in. COVID-19, the climate change impacts in KZN and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has fueled global and local inflation, were among the challenges raised. The party says it's placing more emphasis on social compacting, getting different spheres of society like government, business and communities to work together, and says its economic policies underpin government's current economic reconstruction and recovery plan.
Overall, ANC's strategy for structural reform and rapidly accelerated and inclusive economic growth is built on the following pillars: structural reforms of network industries to facilitate expanded investment in sectors such as electricity, telecoms, water, rail, and road infrastructure. Strengthening industrial policy intervention using a range of instruments, including development finance, public procurement, and linkages to key areas such as agriculture and energy.
The ruling party has reiterated its support for climate mitigation strategies, but says the just transition process is imperative to ensure that communities that have relied on carbon-emitting industries like coal are not left behind in any transition. At the same time, the party is also keen for the country to pursue exploration of gas and oil prospects, which could be viewed as contradictory.
This country, as we speak right now, has a threat to energy security. And the obligation to transit from coal means that we need to begin to explore gas and oil, because at least with regard to those two fossil sources, there's still to be deadline for us to exit them completely. It's only with regard to coal that by 2050 we're expected to exit.
Much emphasis was placed on addressing the issue of broad-based access to the internet and digital services.
We have put up a target as the ANC that at least by the end of June, most of our 9 million South Africans who are supposed to benefit from digital migration, we should have done so by the end of June. We have so far as the ANC instructed our government to implement, and they've been doing very well. We must commend Comrade Nchaveni, Comrade Kubai and the team in our government for the work done so far related to digital migration.
Despite the faltering post office, the ANC remains keen to implement a national postal bank, which it says would be an accessible bank for ordinary people with the ability to pay government grants. It says more focus needs to be given to supporting SMMEs and the township economy in order for them to thrive. It's proposing re-looking at SOEs, which ones are of strategic importance and need to be retained and supported, with a view to consolidation of the sector. The ANC said it wants to see more youngsters going for vocational courses, helping to close the gap in terms of people's qualifications versus what the economy requires. An emphasis on broader skills development is also high on the agenda, with the importation of scarce skills said to be welcomed where necessary. Nompumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Nompumelelo Siziba on that briefing that the ANC's Economic Transformation Committee gave yesterday, taking journalists through some of the thinking in those documents. Now, a person who has been watching the ANC very closely and who has just released a discussion document on this is Dr. Asghar Adelzadeh, who joins us on the line. Good evening, Doc. Thank you very much for your time. Now, in your introduction, just going through the document you have just released, you begin by tracing the ANC's economic journey, ostensibly to show the links between government-adopted economic views and, of course, whether the outcomes, the economic outcomes that we have seen over the past 25 years or so. Tell us why you felt it was important to bring that context, into our attention, given where things are right now.
Well, thank you for inviting me to your program, and good evening to your viewers. It's a really good question. I think when we look at the past 25 years and we're looking at the persistent low economic growth, high unemployment rate of about 27% over the past 26 years since 1996, or low growth rate of about 2.6% average over the last 25 years. And we try to find out why South Africa is stuck in low growth, high unemployment rate, highest inequality in the world, and persistent high poverty. Then that's part of like the journey of this article, trying to go back and trace it with decisions or positions that were taken. And as you know, in economics, there are two major schools of thoughts in economics: mainstream economics and heterodox economics. And these view the working of a market economy differently and the role of the state and the policies very differently. Now, what the article does is that it goes back and looks at the ANC from 1940s all the way to early 1992, the Ready to Govern period, where it looks at the pronouncements of the ANC during that period, the liberation of it during 1940s and during the Africans Claims period, and also the Freedom Charter and Ready to Govern, and looks at it and said this. At that period, the ANC was more driven, seems that, in its economic views by heterodox view of the role of the state, of the view of the economy, of its policies for post-apartheid period. However, after 1992, it gradually drifted and shifted to more mainstream economics until 1996, when it adopted GEAR and fully embraced mainstream economics. Now, what this article is arguing is that that shift that took place and the positions that were taken, it has not been inconsequential. That decision has had impact on policies, on the role of the state, and on the outcomes of these in the past 25 years. So that's very important. Those decisions were not just simple, it has, and it tries to trace that, both in terms of policies, what was that, and the implication of it empirically. How does it go in terms of our expenditures and government fiscal policies, monetary policies, and outcomes that we have seen over the past 25 years.
Okay, now before we talk to, some of the actual decisions that were taken during those, or over those, over the years, just from, because I couldn't help but, ask this question as I was going through some of the things that the paper says. Did you get a sense overall that there was a deliberateness about every step or decision that was taken over the past 25, 28 years or so ago? Or did it depend on who was sitting at the top of the table and how confident they were or may have been about themselves, and how they were able to get others, around the table to agree with them? Did it seem to you like that the ANC said, this is what we need to do for this, that, and the other reason? And when that didn't work, then they decided to, change course and do something else and so on. Did you manage to get to or put a finger on that one?
That's really important. But actually, I think when it comes to economic policies, the government has been overall pretty consistent. It adopted gear in early 1996. By early 2000, it was evident gear was not producing the results that promised. It did not reach that 6% growth. So they started, and the unemployment was going up, and the government started looking at what needs to be done. And what it did, it brought in issues of, again, stayed with the same framework, and looked at the macroeconomic constraints, looking at the removal of what are the constraining private sector investments and removing of those constraints. And over the past 20 years, it has been series of these experiments, trying to get the market economy work, trying to find out where those constraints are and removing those constraints. And part of looking over the 25 years and not to go through one year after year of decisions and changes and ups and downs is to see the overall outlook, and you see that consistency. And we see that even though at the beginning, in early 2000s, when the government was seeking a solution to the problem of rising unemployment, they were hopeful that the removing of these constraints will lead to higher growth and employment. What we find in 2019, a strategy document from Treasury, it's the same methodology. A whole range of constraints they say we have to remove, but this time what is interesting is that they're not anymore promising high growth and high employment. In fact, it says that over the next 10 years, we generate the strategy will generate 1 million jobs, even though you need 8, 9 to 10 million jobs. So what is interesting is that it's as if it has come to the end of that journey, that mainstream economics that was adopted and was tried and tried and tried through the ASGISA, through the NDP, through the 9-point plan, and on, and through the 2019 strategy that was hoping that it will unlock that growth and employment. Now the government, it seems does not even itself, through the projections that has been put forward, that the growth will be 1.5% and unemployment rate is going to go up over the next 5 years to 38.3%. This is projection from the Treasury and World Bank. That it seems now they don't even, it doesn't seem like that strategy, there is even the government believe that it will yield to higher growth. And that's why the paper argues that it seems like the government, the ANC government, has reached a crossroad. Either it stays with the mainstream economics that it knows that it is not going to get the high growth and employment, or it needs to relook at economic policy framework and look at experiment of many other countries that use heterodox economics and generated better outcomes.
Now, one quick question before I move to I bring Pelisa in here. Would it be correct for me to say that on the account of your paper, your document, over the years, as the ANC went through these periods in government, it would come up with ideas, policies, views, but then whenever those did not deliver what was expected, all they would do is merely acknowledge the fact that those policies aren't working and then move on to try something else. But at no point, or very little, was done by way of explaining or analyzing why those policies, didn't deliver as expected in the first place. Would it be correct for me to put it as simply as that? But I'm not an economist, but also, this is not a business or an economics show. We're talking to, ordinary people,
right. Well, look, Roy, if you look at the empirical part of the paper, what do we find? You look at it, even though, like you're saying, that there's introspective and different plans were crafted and put forward. When you look at this and you find out that, for example, monetary policy, interest rates, South African short-term and long-term interest rate has been consistently over 25 years above all the OECD countries. These are interest rates that affects small businesses, large businesses, investments, households purchases, housing, everything. It has been consistent. In other words, what it means is that regardless of those ups and downs, those decisions that were taken, inflation targeting in 1990s, it ruled and it had that impact on the economy. And those kind of empirical regularities that the 25 years of experience has provided us, I think enable us to reach to a decision, to kind of ask the questions: have we reached to a point that we can look back and says, this experiment, we can put that experiment of the non-negotiable policy position that was taken in 1996 has reached its finality, has reached to a point that is not producing the jobs, that is creating more and more inequalities. Poverty remains in persistence, and the growth is stuck in low growth rate, and that's and the interesting thing is that the projections of a Treasury to 2026 is that the growth rate of the economy is going to be average 1.5%. 1.5%. That is the lowest if you look at the empirical work in the document compared to other countries' outlook, and the unemployment rate going up to 38.3% by 2026. I mean, that is unbelievable that we have a scenario where we put a policy document that says all of these, if they all get implemented, unemployment rate is going to go up and average growth rate is going to be 1.5%. I mean, that is what we are, that's what is the issue right now.
Pelisa, you've had an opportunity to go through some of the propositions that are meant to strengthen economic recovery and reconstruction to build an inclusive economy, as it is put in Chapter 9 of the document that the ANC released. Overall, when you've read, when you've gone through everything, listened to what everyone has had to say, are these proposals, contained in this document, an answer to our problems?
I think, the document as it stands, if you, break it into two parts, I think the first one is around the diagnosis of what is the challenges that we're confronted with. I think the diagnosis, it does give a deep dive in terms of what are the challenges that we're confronted with. And I think you must give it to the ANC in this context, is that they're always quite good in undertaking the diagnosis. And I think, acknowledging, in fact, there's even another component where they acknowledge that there were certain things that they've not been able to meet, and they're thinking about what is it that needs to be done, and they're hoping to use the policy conference, for example, to actually get some of the decisions. And then there's a second component, which is around the solutions. And I think which Asga has already really set out a very, interesting foundation. I mean, is that if you don't get your macroeconomic ideological foundation correctly, even if some of your intervention might appear to be, correct in the paper, but in fact, the execution is always going to be skewed. And let me get into a little bit of the details of what I mean. Is that, so for instance, if you talk about several interventions, which in fact in this paper, what actually seemed to be the case is that macroeconomic or economic policy interventions have kind of like really been reduced into project interventions. Now, one of the challenges about projects interventions is that in fact you kind of like really only rely on fiscal instruments to actually support you in achieving what you're looking for, which amongst those, for example, you're looking for funding to deal with issues around infrastructure investment, for instance. If you're looking at issues around skills development, you're expecting, fiscal, policy tools. But then you then get into other components. So for instance, on the structural reforms around the network industries, etc. If you look at the package of issues, in fact, it's quite consistent with some of the announcements that were made about a week ago too, which are called structural reforms in the network industries, which is telecoms, water, etc. Which at the heart of it is actually really introducing, or creating opportunities for private sector opportunities for private sector to play a role. And the danger about that is that once private sector play a role in areas where, or in services where they're classified as public good, and government is expected to actually play a critical role, is that you're going to push the cost of those services, because private sector's interest is to maximize profit. So instead, what this policy paper was meant to do as part of its structural reform is to dig deeper. And I take exactly what Agza had said around macroeconomic issues, which they are not in this paper. The other component was to dig deeper on the issues around of what are the type of microeconomic reforms that needs to be undertaken, at a firm level, and that information is actually missing. So South Africa, for example, has become a primary exporter of several primary goods with absolutely no value added, which in essence, the point that Saskia is making is that, in fact, that, we've really run out of options. But you also gain a sense in the paper broadly. There's an anxiety about exactly what is it that we're confronted with and the crisis we're confronted with. I think the issue, they highlight the issue around the fact that 80%, of households in South Africa are actually those who are classified as going through either social inequality, unemployment, income inequality, or even wealth inequality. And that the list goes on, even with access to education. But I do think that there are a few also mistakes that the paper does make. For instance, it assumes, for example, it talks about income inequality within the private sector, which it actually acknowledges that it's something that it's not been able to clearly articulate and actually give a direction of how to deal with income inequality, which in fact has been the driver of wages in the South African economy. But then it sneaks in a point around the role of education, that the more people are getting educated, and that's when actually, people are going to be able to earn an income. And the misnomer about that point is the fact that education is not guaranteed to be actually an equalizer in society where there's a history of discrimination and exclusion and separate development. And the other contextual issues you always have to build in. So if I put an example, for example, in Black families or African families, where you have an average 9 family members, to have 3 people who are graduated, who are likely to be first generation of graduates, and assume that those three people are actually going to be equalizing income inequality within labor market is actually really problematic, because it also means that it doesn't look at, contextual issues. I mean, the burden, for example, of debt that a lot of people have to incur from, education debt, but not only that, and the fact that by virtue of them being graduates, they still have to carry 9, even sometimes 12 other family members who are actually sitting within their own balance sheet. And I think that's also reflected with the high indebtedness of, middle class that we're experiencing in South Africa, who rely on credit card, for example, to survive. And the data actually shows that even those who are employed, if they lose their jobs, their safety nets will only last them for 3 months. After 3 months, they are pushed back completely, entirely into poverty. They are no longer middle class anymore. So I do think that the paper, of course, does, talk about public employment, which I think it's something that we truly need in South Africa as a relief to make it sure that you actually increase money supply. And obviously that is again linked to the point that Asga is raising around the interest rate. I think we've had the debates around the interest rate and its implications in the economy. But also, the issues around food security. I mean, for me, I still have to say, even though the paper has not gone into detail around food security, I mean, we know the issue around the increase of food costs. And we in South Africa, we're likely to hit, for us, this will be actually a second crisis, in that we've always known that South Africa is a nationally food secure country, but it's a food insecure country at a household level. For example, Gauteng alone has 25% of South African citizens who go to bed without food. And this is a province that contributes 40% of GDP to South African economy. So you can imagine what happens in other provinces who contributes 10%, 8%, 3% of GDP. That is probably even worse, right? So in essence, I think it's a confluence of issues within the paper. I think the paper, the diagnosis is strong, but at the same time, some of the propositions, right, are so project related, and they need the support of a much more stronger macroeconomic thinking. But also at the same time, we also need to really look at the issue around state capacity to deliver, because there are components where South African government has resources, but some of those resources are not managed very well. So if you look at the local government and as well as provincial governments and national government, the duplication and the inefficiencies that exist within the system, because part of it is to manage political, relationships, but also manage more political dynamics so that, people don't turn against each other going forward.
But how good is a diagnostic, document if it is really not going to, if you're not going to get answers to, hundreds of questions that actually emerge from that very same diagnosis? Pelisa?
Sorry, say it again. I missed that question.
I'm saying, of what use is this beautiful, great, fantastic diagnosis if, on the same breath, you then turn around and actually give very real, practical, useful, answers to the very questions that you're raising?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the key issues around, by the way, the mainstream economy, it often focuses on short-termism. That's the first thing. And that's why, for example, the National Development Plan has actually not been able to be met, because it's actually been driven by short-termism in planning. I think that's the first issue. And then the second issue, and I hope that in this document, they will make it sure that there's going to be a much more longitudinal planning. But that planning has to be, underpinned by fresh thinking and fresh perspective, and also a deeper understanding that a project-driven economic interventions are short-term. They're just meant to actually circulate money in the economy for a short term and relieve pressure and calm the waters. But in essence, there must be even a much more long-term commitment to shift the dynamics. So, for example, if I pick up two issues, so the role of the state-owned enterprises and as well as public employment, for instance, right? Now, we need to look at what are the infrastructure programs that the state-owned enterprises are actually pursuing. Now, those infrastructure projects, have, multiple or, multiply effects in the economy, both from a demand side as well as from the supply side. But obviously, what becomes the key inhibitor there is that most of the state-owned enterprises are actually supposed to comply with a PFMA, which prioritizes the issues of price versus localization. Now, I heard the head of ETC really, being emphatic in her delivery on the industrialization and localization. But you're not going to be able to achieve localization, no industrialization, including what this paper seeks to achieve. If, for instance, your public procurement policy sits with, its own contradiction, which amongst those is that it's not willing to push for the South African economy to actually pay a premium for localization. Okay. Every country in the world today that is industrialized had paid its own premium, whether it's a price premium or it's related with anything else.
Doc, you somewhere in the document, you ask the question as you go towards your conclusions. What if the government is willing to reconsider its economic views and policies? Are you able to answer that question?
Yes, what we have done is that we actually, the last part of the paper is saying that what if exactly that the government adopts a heterodox view and craft policies. And we go ahead, we use economic modeling. We have a large economic model of a South African economy, develop the scenarios for public investments, for government expenditures, for monetary policy, for social policy, for private sector interventions, all of these in details, in quantitative, and then run the model and generate it. We show that it is possible to achieve the average growth of reach to 6% growth rate, raise the investment to about 70 to 27% of the GDP, able to generate about 9 million jobs over the rest of this decade, and bring the unemployment rate to about 12.5%, reduce the poverty rate by half over the rest of this decade. We quantified this, and we showed that these are also will reduce actually the growth that it will generate, the income, the revenue that it generates. It helps expand the social expenditures, and at the same time that growth helps reduce gradually the debt GDP ratio. And so we provided that as the last part of the paper as an alternative, that this crossroad that we say that the ANC government is, if you look at it, this alternative and these what if scenarios, it provides, it quantifies and including the macroeconomic, changes, we took those into consideration. So it is possible. In other words, what I'm saying is that it is possible for this economy doesn't need to be stuck in this low growth, high unemployment rate, high poverty rate.
Pelisa, there's a mid-year policy conference where this is going to go, and then of course there is also the elective conference where these policies would have to be adopted. But there's another reality, given where ANC things are stuck right now. I think everyone, it would seem, is focused on who would be president, who will be this and that, and that kind of a thing. Any realistic chance, I'm talking to someone who at least knows better the system, better than, the three of us together, how realistic are we being here, and that in the hope that these conversations will be thoroughly, these issues will be thoroughly interrogated come the policy conference, and of course beyond that there will be very concrete decisions taken or adopted by the party at their elective conference in December?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pressure is actually being felt. I think the pressure is coming through in this paper. That's what I was talking about, picking up an energy of anxiety. I do think that, for example, I mean, for the first time, this paper recognizes the need, the informal sector, the micro enterprises, and the need to make it sure that actually we don't use your mainstream and, formal one-size-fits-all rules of dealing with micro enterprises. It talks about the micro credit act, for instance, which is some of the things that have not been there in the previous document. Now, obviously, what that signals, it signals that we've been, out of the diagnosis, there is a commitment to actually make sure that we implement. But I do think that there's also an acknowledgement that we've reached a ceiling point. So if you look at the speech of the president and as well as the minister, the president announced that in 90 days, 3 months' time, we should be, presenting a clear economic recovery plan to this country. But at the same time, the minister actually, was kind of like at pains and saying we should be concerned when we have citizens that are above 46% who rely on social security or cash transfers from the state. And I think for me, that was signaling that already, I think within the inner, leadership of the ANC, there's a recognition that this is actually a crisis. I do hope that whatever even the leadership contestation that is going to take place, that there's a recognition amongst the ordinary ANC members that South Africans are actually trapped in poverty. And in fact, we could actually make a difference. But I do think that I just want to invite South Africans, now that these documents are actually open in the public, which I do think that we should express our gratitude to the ANC to present this document in public, that citizens must actually write to the ANC and say, we think this is going to work and that this is going to work, particularly those who continue to vote for the ANC, who may not be part of the conference. Because when you have that groundswell of ideas coming from ordinary citizens, I think the ANC is going to start feeling the pressure that it's not only the 4,800 or 5,000 members who are attending the policy conference or the elective conference, that in fact citizens are actually concerned about the state of this country. In fact, there's a component here which I also liked where they talk about the role of labor and even the role of community. And I would hope that in practice, that the role of labor and community, it's not only it's not only something that's written in paper, but that in fact, there's an engagement with communities, about what type of economic trajectory for their own communities that we want to go into. So there's an allocation, it's kind of like there's a very interesting stakeholder, a component that has been well articulated here. Even though I think there are a few gaps, I do think that there's an opportunity to use this document to galvanize citizens so that you better understand what is it that citizens are looking for. But at the same time, that should actually lead into actually a change in attitude and begin to actually recognize that short-termism has actually led into 35.3% of unemployment in this country, 77% of young people who are actually unemployed, and that we actually need to shift the gear and make it sure that we gain the value that is linked to what this economy could actually deliver to all South Africans and build an inclusive, not only society, but also where citizens enjoy access to income and they lead productive life and they are feeling financially secured.
Okay, if you just joined us, we are in conversation with Dr. Asgar Adelzadeh, who has just released a document entitled "Why is the South African Economy Stuck in Chronic Crises?" Pelis Wangomo is a development analyst who is also very familiar with the inner workings of the ANC. Of course, tomorrow we are going to hear the latest from the people who put together the labor survey as to where we are with regard to unemployment. And Michael Bagrain, a labor analyst, is going to join the conversation. That's after this short ad break. Welcome back. And if you have just joined us, we're looking at the ANC's thoughts on what will turn our struggling economy around. This in a week, we're also going to hear more bad news, as many analysts have been pointing out. The fuel price is expected to go up again on Wednesday, and new unemployment figures are coming out tomorrow. Now, you'll recall that the last quarterly labor force survey for the second quarter of 2021 painted a grim picture of unemployment in our country. It was the worst since the survey's introduction in 2008. Now, let's welcome our analyst. Michael, welcome to the show, and thanks very much for joining us. Just your thoughts on what we could expect tomorrow.
Thank you. Yes, the thoughts are that it's going to be worse than ever. Unfortunately, the unemployment figures of every quarter for the last 10 years have been getting worse and worse. And none of the economic factors show that it's going to get any better. In fact, as you pointed out, the price of fuel is going up. I suppose we can't really help that, except I must tell you that the government is probably taxing that to the hilt. We've seen all sorts of figures come out on that one. The world is suffering at the moment, obviously, with the attack on Ukraine. We've seen that. And then, of course, our government has not played ball. They've been absolutely reluctant to ensure that in any way small business is keen to employ any people. So every time you have an idea, every time a government minister like Tita Mboweni said, let's decouple small business from the bargaining councils, from big business, he was destroyed, and he was told not a chance. The reality is that the big unions, the COSATUs of the day, are trying to protect their own members who are in employment, and they certainly don't want to make it any easier for others to find their way into the employment circles. And so what we've got is that the unions, to a large degree, are controlling what the governing party is doing, what the ANC is doing, and the ANC doesn't want to do anything to irritate the trade union movement. So I think the figures are going to be a lot worse. This is not the end of it. It's going to get worse every quarter until we see a turnaround. That turnaround is going to be only after, hopefully, 2024, when the workers themselves speak loudly and they vote with their feet. I don't believe we're going to see the workerist movement coming forward and voting for an ANC government. You saw what happened at May Day, the May Day discussions, the celebrations for May Day weren't a celebration. It was almost like a funeral. And in fact, our president got thrown out of the meeting, almost forcibly. Which is pretty sad in that it is the president of the country, but the workers are speaking, and I think quite rightly so. They are under threat. The numbers are going down. People are being retrenched. I, as a labor lawyer, for instance, have spent the last 3 years retrenching people. I haven't had the opportunity to even put together letters of appointment or contracts of employment. I've never had it so bad. I've been practicing labor law for over 35 years, and I've never seen it this bad that it is right now. We know that even electricity is a disaster. If businesses, sorry.
Dr. Adelzadeh, as Michael was talking, I was taken. I was in my head, going down memory lane, remembering how, and there's something you capture, you capture a bit of this in your document. I mean, I remember the days when government shifted gear, as it were, and the unions, together with the Communist Party, I mean, I'm talking about COSATU specifically, as well as the South African Communist Party, took the government on, and Nelson Mandela, you bring that moment to life somewhere in your document, how he defended, the government's position on or adoption of gear, and how later on, they had egg on their faces, as it were, because that gear didn't quite deliver the way they thought they would. And here's Michael saying, or suggesting that the government actually listens to the unions. And we've been hearing, in fact, from even that incident, I mean, the NUM and AMCU there were together, they were united, in their around criticism of how the Sibanye Stillwater was behaving, and they've been standing together since then, prepared and ready, willing and seemingly able to stand their ground. Just from, I mean, does your research back, the view or notion that the unions remain powerful?
Well, I believe they do.
I think it is, they have influence. I'm not sure. My focus has not been so much to see the changes. I think the breaking of the union obviously has weakened their bargaining position in the government, I think. It would have been better if they were united and put their position forward together. I think the major issue that we have here, and which the ANC document right now is once again is kind of sidestepping, is the role that macroeconomic policy plays at the end of the day in turning their country around. And this, and until that issue is I think is addressed, the same way that in 1996 the government took a macroeconomic policies and says this macroeconomic policy is going to pay off. Now it hasn't. It doesn't mean there's no other macroeconomic policies that can do, but that role is essential, and I think it is missing in action. It is still, business as usual in that sense. We are chasing microeconomic interventions, trying to, deal with potholes rather than bigger issues. I mean, when you're dealing with the interest rate, it cascades so many different ways, from households to small businesses to industrialists to everywhere. It has implication everywhere. So not to say that we're not going to deal with the macro, deal with whether monetary policy has really been helping through its credit extension that almost dried out credit extension in the country. I mean, in the 2000, average annual growth rate was of credit extension to private sector was 15.5%. It has come down to less than 5%. Now, we can talk about SMMEs until, whenever, but without interest rate policies that helps, or credit extension policies that helps the growth of that sector, they're going to be always complaining about access to credit, access to finance, and on, no matter how many surveys year after year gets done. So it is things, all fiscal policy. I mean, the government revenue and expenditure policies, those dip, especially as it relates to transformation, as it relates to services, whole range of areas, and also its macroeconomic effects. We have spent many years focusing on the supply side of the economic, thinking that the supply side economics will help economic growth, and underestimated the role that aggregate demand in the economy plays. And I think unless that also is addressed as part of that consideration of a macroeconomic policy of the government, I think we can have a lot of issues, a lot of discussions around every sector of the economy, issues of every aspect of the economy that needs to be fixed. But it is, does it lead to economic growth? Does it lead to higher employment rate, bringing down the unemployment? I mean, the unemployment rate in South Africa in the past 2 decades have been the official above 20%. I mean, that is unbelievable around the world. And there is a graph in the document that we put forward that shows the unemployment rate in South Africa has been consistently, significantly higher than all the other OECD countries. There is no exceptionalism that to explain this way about South Africa. You can't say that over 25 years there was some kind of situation in South Africa that warrant some of these outcomes. There's a consistency in those outcomes, and I think that's where we're saying that there's a time. It's time to have a retrospective look at what happened over the past 25 years and what is missing. Otherwise, putting out the strategy documents that are all on the micro and supply side, they're helpful, but I do not think that it will, even Treasury, when it quantified all its macro intervention in 2019, current ANC document is the child of that document. It says even if you introduce all of those, you're still going to have a low growth outcome and high unemployment rate outcome. So that's,
When all has been said and done, what still gives you hope that we will eventually, be able to, deal with our unemployment crisis, which, Michael was saying, from what you can see, tomorrow we're not going to hear any better news than we've heard so far.
We're not. In fact, if I can just
okay, go ahead, Peter. Sorry, we seem to have
No, I'm saying if I can say if I issue of unemployment and what should we expecting. Part of what, for example, ASCA is arguing on the macroeconomic policy is the fact that part of that macroeconomic policy had actually promoted export-led growth, which in fact is actually working against the labor market as of today. Because the issue about export-led growth is that South Africa has then been focusing on exporting, a primary processed product without the value add. In ASCA's document, one of the points he raises is the issue of decline in industrial intensity in South Africa, which is a measurement that gets used by UNIDO, that in fact has declined by 17%. What that means is that in fact, what we've even inherited from the apartheid in as far as industrial capacity has actually been lost. And part of the reason why it's been lost is because we export primary goods, so we're pursuing export-led growth instead of employment-driven growth. And then in return, all the consumption goods we then tend to import. So obviously that makes our labor market in the economy very vulnerable. And that's why we've been seeing these numbers of 35%. And of course, obviously, one would argue and say that, trade unions might be enjoying a lot of power. But in fact, trade unions have been really consistent in the last 20 years, 2 decades, around the nature of macroeconomics and the fact that an export-led growth might be giving foreign earnings to South Africa and pushing up its trade balance. But its implication in the long term is that, in fact, it's destroying the very industrial capability. So if you look, for example, in the textile industry, we import textile industry through liberalization. We import almost everything, right? If you look at sectors like steel industry, they export primary processed goods, but we import everything else that needs to be consumed in sectors that are associated with it. If you look at the automotive industry, so the opportunity that this paper,
Okay, I don't know what is going on here this evening. Michael, last word from you. Just from, and I begin perhaps in answering or in whatever closing comments you'll be making, I begin to know, and I'm sure a lot of people would also, what are the reasons? You're saying you've been dealing, you've practically spent the past few years, dealing with a situation where people are losing jobs and so on. Why are people or companies, shedding jobs? Why do they say they are unable to, employ more people at a very, plain and simple level? What are the contributing factors in the main?
I just wanted to comment. I know everyone's looking at the macroeconomic situation, and the previous speakers were looking at that. But All the economists are telling us that jobs will be created by small business. Small business, I've been dealing with for years and years. They're telling me they won't employ because of the harsh regulatory labor environment. They're telling me they won't employ because it's so difficult to dismiss. They're telling me they won't employ because it's so costly to employ in the first place. It's easier to get a divorce than to dismiss an employee. Let's be practical. It's not big business that's creating jobs at all. They've got jobless growth. It's small business. And everywhere around the world, we're seeing small business creating jobs. We need to do that. We can't worry about discussions about macroeconomics. We can't worry about a foolish government who keeps putting plans together. Those plans are worth nothing. They don't create one job. What you need is a small business environment that every small business takes in another 10, 15 employees, and that those employees in turn get skills and possibly even open their own small businesses. We've got to get back to basics. This government is not going to do it. They can't do it. They are tied to the trade unions. They're tied to big business. We need to get back to basics in South Africa, and we need to create jobs now. If this is bad, I believe that we're closer to 50% unemployment, and our youth are at 70% unemployment. That's close to an Arab Spring. This is impossible. We need government to leave, get his hand off the tiller, put other politicians in place, and free up small business to create jobs. That's what we've got to do, and we've got to do it right now. We can't wait. We're dying slowly. We're getting very close to a failed state. Everyone is saying that, and no one seems to want to recognize it. It's a bit like the frog in the hot water. You keep adding hot water, the frog doesn't realize it's burning to death. And that's what's happening to all of us. All of us have, every single family has a problem with unemployment.
And that's where we're going to leave this evening. Thanks to all of you for coming through. Michael Bagrain there, who is a labor analyst. Peli Songomo is a development economist. We're also joined by Dr. Asgar Adel-Zadeh, who has just written a discussion document entitled, Why is the South African Economy Stuck in Chronic Crises? And that's what we had for you this evening. To join us again tomorrow night, same time, 8 p.m. sharp. Have a good night.